What are best practices for tables and accessibility? When we see a table, we immediately start making visual associations between the data and the headers, right? For example, let's say that this table is a representation of our pets. We have 2 dogs and 2 cats, and the table is showing us their names and ages. While a sighted person may be able to understand the relationships in this table, making the connection between the values and the headers is much harder for people who use screen readers to navigate the table. As a web developer, you are in charge of creating these associations and structuring your HTML markup in a way that is also easy for screen reader users to interpret. So let's see how you can create accessible tables that everyone can understand. The first best practice that we will cover is using table captions. With the caption element, you can write the caption or title of a table so users, especially those who use assistive technologies, can quickly understand the table's purpose and content. You should place the caption element immediately after the opening tag of the table element. This way, screen readers and other assistive technologies can provide more context by announcing the caption before reading the content. Now let's talk about row and column headers. Headers are special cells, typically found at the start of a row or column, that describe the type of data stored in that row or column. You can define a row or column header with the table header element. For example, here we have a table with 2 pets. Every row has a row header, the name of the pet, and every column has a column header, which describes what the data in the column represents, age and type. This is the same table in HTML. Notice that it has a caption element immediately after the opening table element. Then, inside the table head element, it has the column headers, name, age, and type. In the second and third rows, inside the table body element, we find the data of each one of our pets. The names of the pets are the row headers because they are inside table header elements, TH. Associating the data cells with their corresponding headers is also very important for screen readers. The scope attribute determines if a header is a row header or a column header. Screen readers may guess this correctly from the table structure, but it's usually recommended to explicitly indicate the scope to ensure clarity. The scope attribute has 4 possible values. The 2 that you will use most often are col for column and row for row. Here you can see that we added the scope attribute to the column and row headers. The 3 column headers, name, age, and type, have a scope of column. The 2 row headers, Nora and Gino, have a scope of row. If a column or row header spans across multiple cells, the scope will also be applied to each one of the cells individually. Here is an example of that. In this table, the cell with Nora's age, 5, will have 1 column header, age, and 2 row headers, dogs and Nora. Gino's age, 2, will also have 1 column header, age, and two row headers, dogs and Gino. However, some screen readers may not be able to interpret tables with these complex structures, so you should try to flatten the table as much as possible to avoid row and column headers that span across multiple cells. Your goal should always be to make sure that users can access this information, even if their screen readers can't handle complex table structures. Now, for cell width, it's recommended to avoid using fixed values. You should use relative values instead, like percentages. Also, try to avoid defining cell height. This will allow users to adjust text size to fit their needs. And finally, you should let the browser determine the table width whenever possible to reduce the need for horizontal scrolling. HTML tables are essential for presenting structured data in an accessible and understandable format. By following these accessibility guidelines, you can create tables that are easy to understand for every there is a row header or a column header. Screen readers may guess this correctly from the table structure, but it's usually recommended to explicitly indicate the scope. Have a scope of column. The two row headers, Nora and Gino, have a scope of row. If a column or row header spans across multiple cells, the scope will also be applied to each one of the cells individually. Why is it important for inputs to have an associated label? Labels on input fields might seem like small details, but they play a crucial role in making forms easier for everyone to use. Labels help people with disabilities make forms more user-friendly for everyone and ultimately improve form conversion rates. Let's dive into why adding labels to input elements is important for accessibility and usability. Screen readers often rely on labels to describe the purpose of input fields. In order for this to work properly, the label must be programmatically associated with the input. While there are several ways to do that, the most common one is to use the HTML label element. Here's how to associate a label with an input. In this example, the for attribute of the label element is associated with the ID of the input element. This connection allows screen readers to announce the label when the input is in a focused state, allowing screen reader users to understand the purpose of the input. Associating labels with all input fields also benefits SEO, search engine optimization. With proper labels, search engines will understand the page content better, leading to a positive impact on the page search rankings. But it is important to understand that you're making content for humans, not search engines. So you should make sure the labels are as clear and descriptive as possible. What is the purpose of WAI ARIA and how does it work? Making static content accessible can be relatively straightforward, but dynamic content can be more challenging. This is where WAI ARIA comes in. Let's look at what WAI ARIA is, its purpose, how it works, and some examples. WAI ARIA stands for Web Accessibility Initiative, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's a specification that enhances accessibility for dynamic content and user interface components. Note that WCAG and WAI ARIA are not the same. WCAG provides general guidelines for web accessibility, while WAI ARIA offers specific rules for making dynamic and interactive content accessible for users of assistive technologies. So the primary purpose of WAI ARIA is to improve accessibility for dynamic content and UI components that do not have native HTML equivalents. WAI ARIA works by introducing a set of attributes that you can add to HTML elements to provide additional semantic information. These attributes are categorized into roles, states, and properties. ARIA role defines the purpose of an element within a website or web app. Here is an example of setting the role to button for a div element. By doing this, you're indicating to the assistive technology that the element is a button. Roles do not provide any functionality, however. Merely giving this div a role of button will not make it act like a button. To make it look and behave like a button, you would need to use CSS and JavaScript to get the desired result. It is always better to use the native button or input element with type button instead. Since HTML alone does not provide a way to make custom user interface components like tab navigation, tab list accessible, ARIA roles can be very helpful. Here is what a tab list could look like with the role attribute. Each tab in the tab list will have an associated tab panel that will display when its tab is selected. Each tab panel will have a role of tab panel. Here's what each one of those tab panels could look like. ARIA state describes the current status of an element, which can change based on user interactions. An example is the ARIA expanded attribute for collapsible sections. Again, this is merely describing the state. It does not provide any functionality. You would have to use JavaScript to change the state of the attribute when the user clicks the button. ARIA properties provide additional details about elements. For example, the ARIA labeled by property lets you connect an element to a specific label. This will make the elements understandable and navigable for users of assistive technologies. To get the best out of WAI ARIA, try to stick with native HTML whenever possible, since it generally provides more accessibility out of the box. Use WAI ARIA only when HTML falls short. And don't forget to test with assistive technologies like screen readers. Also, make sure your WAI ARIA states and properties update with the content in real time. Avoid overusing ARIA as it can be confusing many times. What are ARIA roles? ARIA stands for Accessibility Rich Internet Applications. ARIA roles specify the semantic meaning of HTML elements. They're essential for making web content accessible to people who use assistive technologies like screen readers. HTML has semantic and non-semantic elements based on whether they convey meaning about their content. Many semantic HTML elements already have an ARIA role assigned by default. For example, the button element has a default ARIA role of button, but non-semantic elements don't have a role. For example, screen readers will not know how to interpret the purpose of a div if you don't specify its role explicitly. To specify the ARIA role of an element, you just need to add the role attribute, like this, where value is the name of a role in the ARIA specification. It is important to note that specifying a role on an element only does one thing. It informs assistive technologies of the purpose of the element. It does not add any functionality or behavior to the element. If people expect a role to behave a certain way, it is up to you, the developer, to add that expected behavior. For example, adding a role of button to a div does not automatically make it clickable with a mouse or usable with a keyboard. It is the responsibility of the developer to add the expected behavior that allows the div to act like a button, and in most cases, it is just better to use the button element. There are 6 main categories of ARIA roles: document structure roles, widget roles, landmark roles, live region roles, window roles, and abstract roles. Let's take a look at them in more detail. Document structure roles define the overall structure of the web page. With these roles, assistive technologies can understand the relationships between different sections and help users navigate the content. However, most of the document structure roles are not used in modern web development because browsers already support equivalent semantic HTML elements, which should be prioritized whenever possible. You should specify the roles that don't have an equivalent semantic element. For example, toolbar, tooltip, feed, map, presentation, none, and note. There are other similar roles, but these are the most commonly used ones. This is an example of a div with a math ARIA role. The div contains a mathematical equation. You'll also notice that the div has an ARIA label attribute. The value of this attribute should be a string that represents the expression. Widget roles define the purpose and functionality of interactive elements, like scroll bars. Examples of widget roles include scroll bar, search box, separator when focusable, slider, spin button, switch, tab, tab panel, and tree item. Some of these roles have equivalent semantic elements. You should prioritize the semantic element over the role if there is one. For example, you should favor using the HTML button element over adding a role of button to a div. Landmark roles classify and label the primary sections of a web page. Screen readers use them to provide convenient navigation to important sections of a page. You should use them sparingly to keep the overall layout simple and easy to understand. Examples of landmark roles are banner, complementary, content info, form, main, navigation, region, and search. Each one of these roles has a corresponding HTML equivalent, such as header, footer, aside, form, main, nav, section, and search. If you use the proper HTML elements to define the sections of your page, then it is not necessary to explicitly add the role attribute to these elements. Live region roles define elements with content that will change dynamically. This way, screen readers and other assistive technologies can announce changes to users with visual disabilities. These roles include alert, log, marquee, status, and timer. Window roles define sub-windows, like pop-up modal dialogues. These roles include alert dialog and dialog. Please note that it is now considered a best practice to use the HTML dialog element and its associated JavaScript methods instead of manually creating a dialog. And finally, we have abstract roles. These roles help organize the document. They're only meant to be used internally by the browser, not by developers, so you should know that they exist, but you shouldn't use them on your website or web applications. With ARIA roles, you can create accessible and inclusive websites and web applications. They provide semantic information about the purpose and function of HTML elements. Screen readers and other assistive technologies use this information to help users understand the content of your page and set expectations for how to use it, which helps ensure that everyone can have a great user experience. what are the roles of the ARIA label and ARIA labeled by attributes? It is important to make sure that all users, including those living with disabilities, can access websites without issues. For people using screen readers, the ARIA label and ARIA labeled by attributes provide crucial information about page elements that might be unclear or invisible. Let's look at what the ARIA label and ARIA labeled by attributes are and the roles they play in making the web accessible to people with visual impairments and related disabilities. You'll notice both ARIA label and ARIA labeled by are prefixed with ARIA. So what does that mean? ARIA stands for Accessible Reach Internet Applications. It's a set of attributes prefixed with ARIA, which lets developers communicate the purpose of elements to assistive technologies. The ARIA label attribute is an invisible label for interactive elements. It adds a text label to an element that screen readers can read. ARIA label is especially useful for elements that do not have visible text but still need to be described by screen readers. For example, buttons with only icons often need ARIA label to convey their purpose. Here is an example. In this case, a screen reader may announce this button as Search Button, even though the button only contains an icon. The ARIA label attribute tells screen readers what text to use in place of the icon. If the button contained the text Search instead of an icon, then there would be no need for the ARIA label attribute, as the text would provide the label for the button. For input elements, the ARIA label attribute provides a label directly if there isn't a visible label associated with the input. The ARIA labeled by attribute does the exact same thing as the ARIA label attribute, but instead of defining the text directly in the attribute, you use a reference to text that already exists on the page. The existing text must have an ID attribute, which will be used for the reference value in the ARIA labeled by attribute. Here is an example. In this case, the text for the button is being used as the label for the search input. Screen readers will announce the input as something like Search Edit. If you later decide you want to change the button text to Find, the label for the input will automatically be updated for the new text, since it is referencing the button text. Combining multiple ID values into a single ARIA labeled by attribute value is also possible. Here is how that works. For the slider, the screen reader will look out for the content of the volume label and volume details elements and announce volume adjust the volume level. You've seen that both ARIA label and ARIA labeled by attributes help screen readers understand what elements do. So which one should you use? Since they both provide the same functionality, either can be used, but there may be a few advantages to using ARIA labeled by over ARIA label. If someone is using a translation service to translate the content on your page, the text in an ARIA label attribute may not always be translated. Using ARIA labeled by can also help prevent a mismatch between the visible label text and the invisible label for screen reader users, since updating the visible text will automatically update the invisible label. And ARIA labeled by can make it much easier to programmatically create complex invisible labels consisting of multiple sources of text. One last note, do not use ARIA label and ARIA labeled by on an element at the same time. In this case, the invisible label for screen readers will always be determined by ARIA labeled by, and ARIA label will be completely ignored. What is the ARIA hidden attribute and how does it work? If you ever need to display content while at the same time hiding it from people who use assistive technology like screen readers, you can use the ARIA hidden attribute. You just need to add it to the HTML element that you want to hide and set its value to true, like you can see over here. This attribute hides the element and all of its children from the accessibility tree while keeping them visible on the page. Common use cases include icons and images that only have a decorative purpose and duplicated content. It is important to remember that ARIA Hidden only hides content from assistive technology like screen readers. If the content should be hidden from everyone, then you should not use ARIA Hidden to hide it. For example, a hamburger menu that is currently collapsed must be hidden from all keyboard users, not just screen reader users. In this case, you could set the CSS display property to none on the menu to remove it from the DOM when it is collapsed. You should never use ARIA Hidden to hide an element that is focusable with the keyboard. The ARIA Hidden attribute only removes the element from the accessibility tree. It does not remove it from the DOM. Thus, it will still be possible for screen reader users to tab into the element, but their screen reader will not announce the element, effectively causing them to focus on nothing. Here is an example where we hide an icon from the accessibility tree by adding the ARIA Hidden attribute with a value of true. We only keep the text exposed to assistive technologies to avoid any confusions that may arise from the redundancy of having both an icon and text for the same purpose. You do not need to use ARIA Hidden when the HTML element already has a hidden attribute, when the element or the element's ancestor is already hidden with display none, and when the element or the element's ancestor is already hidden with visibility hidden. In these three cases, the element is already removed from the DOM and thus hidden from the accessibility tree, so the ARIA Hidden attribute is not necessary. As with using any ARIA attributes, you should always test with assistive technologies, and preferably having people with disabilities test your work to make sure that it's easy to understand even with these hidden elements. You should also know that setting ARIA Hidden to false will not expose the element to assistive technologies if any of its parents has this attribute set to true. The ARIA Hidden attribute is used to hide elements from people who use assistive technology, such as screen reader users. While it can be helpful for hiding purely decorative elements and duplicated content, it should be used sparingly to avoid hindering accessibility. In general, all content and functionality available on the page should also be available to people using assistive technology. The use case for ARIA Hidden is very narrow and should be limited primarily to making the experience cleaner for screen reader users by removing purely decorative or duplicate information. Do not use ARIA Hidden to hide content that you don't think screen reader users would be interested in. Screen reader users deserve to have access to all the information on the page. By following these best practices and testing the user experience, you can create inclusive online experiences for everyone. What is the ARIA expanded attribute and how does it work? The ARIA expanded attribute is used for accessibility purposes to indicate if a control is expanded or collapsed. It's used in conjunction with collapsible widgets like menus, accordions, and other disclosure widgets that control the visibility of the content. The ARIA expanded attribute is set to true if the control is expanded, or false if it is collapsed. The information provided by ARIA Expanded allows people using screen readers to understand the current state of the control, whether it's expanded or collapsed. The ARIA Expanded attribute is applied to the interactive element that toggles the visibility of the collapsible widget. For example, if a button toggles an expandable menu, the ARIA Expanded attribute is placed on the button. When the menu is expanded, the ARIA Expanded attribute should be set to true, like in this example. When the menu is collapsed, it should be set to false instead. You must always have the ARIA Expanded attribute set to either true or false on the controlling element. For example, if a button toggles the visibility of a menu, the default value for ARIA Expanded should be based on the default visibility of the menu. If the menu is expanded by default, ARIA Expanded should initially be set to true. If the menu is collapsed by default, ARIA Expanded should initially be set to false. The value of ARIA Expanded should be updated dynamically using JavaScript as the user interacts with the element. Additionally, the properties ARIA controls and ARIA owns can be used in combination with ARIA Expanded to establish a programmatic connection between the controlling element and the element it controls. Let's start with ARIA controls. When used with ARIA Expanded, the ARIA controls attribute is used to specify the element being controlled. For example, a button might expand or collapse a list acting as a menu. The value of ARIA controls will be the ID of the controlled element, the menu list in this example. Notice that the list immediately follows the controlling button. For expandable buttons like this, it is best to have the expanded content immediately follow the element that it controls in the DOM. This prevents screen readers users from having to search for the expanded content and makes it easier for keyboard users to navigate through any interactive controls in the expanded content. It is not possible to place the expanded content immediately after the controlling element. The ARIA owns attribute allows you to virtually move it after the control in the accessibility tree. This allows assistive technology like screen readers to pretend the expanded content is placed directly after the control in the DOM. There are drawbacks to using the ARIA owns attribute. It creates unnecessary verbosity for screen reader users, since most screen readers will automatically read out the entire contents of the expanded element when first expanded. It also does not change the tab order, potentially forcing keyboard users to tab through all of the other interactive controls on the page before reaching the expanded content, unless you manage the tabbing order with JavaScript. Ideally, the expandable content should be placed after the control element, and the ARIA owns attribute should only be used in a worst-case scenario when that is not possible. If it must be used, you will need to thoroughly test with a wide range of screen readers and browsers to ensure that your implementation is accessible for everyone. And just a reminder, when you use either ARIA controls or ARIA owns, the value of ARIA expanded must continue to be updated as the control is expanded and collapsed. The ARIA expanded attribute indicates whether a control is expanded or collapsed. This information is essential for screen reader users, helping them understand the current state of collapsible elements, like menus, accordions, and other similar disclosure widgets. By using ARIA Expanded correctly, you can create an intuitive user experience for everyone.